Hey there, Internet friends. Trevor Starkey here with another episode of AC Saturday, my weekly Saturday show where I sit down and talk about anime or comics. Today we are closing out my thoughts on Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. If you missed part one of my impressions, you can check out the link to that video in the comments below. I basically went through the first two chapters of it last week, so today we're going to kind of hit chapters 3, 4, and then the epilogue and kind of close out my thoughts on the story. So where we left off, Superman was basically creating a gulag to kind of put and house all of the superheroes that aren't really getting in line with his way of thinking, and so that's kind of where we pick up here in part 3. The gulag was built, and within 2 weeks it was filled to the max, and all these superheroes are getting very frustrated and disenfranchised because they're kind of being kept here against their will and treated like villains, and so they're becoming very disenfranchised and just angry, and it's a powder keg waiting to explode. One great little frame that I pulled out here that really stood out to me in describing just Superman as a character was one of these, frustrated, angry, young superheroes kind of talking about Superman as the man of tomorrow, my ass, try man of the 1950s. Times change, but he still expects everyone to live up to some cobwebbed code. I thought it was a very interesting dynamic. So Kingdom Come was originally published in 1996, so the idea of kind of tacking Superman for not being part of the times, not living up to the times, is an interesting kind of approach here. I appreciated it. Even while in part 1, I forgot to mention it in chapter 1 of Kingdom Come, you have like an iconic shot of Superman kind of lifting up a trailer over his head in a direct homage to Action Comics #1, where he's lifting up the car over his head, like same angle and everything like that. So it's interesting here hearing a character kind of talk about Superman as like arcane and too old-fashioned to really, the guy that we're talking, or that is talking in this moment, it has like piercings and stuff and looks kind of punk, so he's like very 90s punk, so it makes sense that he's kind of talking about Superman as like an old man who, times are changing and you can't expect everybody to still live in the past. So it's an interesting, it's very much, I think, speaking directly to a lot of people's criticism of Superman as like, beacon for hope, justice, in the American way. It's hope, justice, in the American way of like 50, 60 years ago now. So it doesn't necessarily, it's hard to translate that to, a more modern age as the ages become more and more modern. We also get a nice little scene between Superman and Wonder Woman in here where Wonder Woman kind of goes more into the exile from Paradise Island that she introduced back in the last part when they were talking to Aquaman. She kind of mentions that she kept trying and the world kept getting worse, and so the Amazons basically said, hey, like, you're not holding up your bargain as the ambassador to mankind, you're not making mankind better, so we're stripping you of your title and your position, and you can't come back. So she's very much kind of been on the outs in the same way that Superman's been on the outs, but Superman, it was self-imposed, whereas Wonder Woman was trying, and her people basically kicked her out. We also get a very interesting look at like where their ideologies are starting to clash here, with Wonder Woman saying, we are warriors, we have an obligation to wage combat, while Superman is saying, given the power we possess, we have a greater obligation to keep the peace. So it's interesting seeing the warrior Wonder Woman versus the peacekeeper Superman, kind of with Wonder Woman being effectively in this story Superman's like lieutenant, number 2 basically. We start seeing throughout, she starts really kind of going out on things that Clark or Superman or Kal wouldn't have done, and she's kind of taking the initiative because she sees his passiveness as a weakness. Elsewhere, we find out that Lex Luthor has been brainwashing Billy Baston, a.k.a. Shazam, or in this iteration, Captain Marvel, for years, preying off of the boy. The boy basically left and kind of shut himself out of using his powers, and Lex Luthor kind of found him and started really, preying on that, and preying on the boy's fear of his power, to kind of use also these weird little earworm things that I think there's some kind of brain control or something going on. But basically, Lex is bringing in Captain Marvel into his fold for his own selfish purposes. All throughout this, of course, we've got our narrator, McKay character, the pastor, who's observing everything. And at one point, while he's observing the ongoings in the Watchtower, the Flash, who is able to, exist in multiple realms simultaneously or so quickly or whatever, the Flash ends up, identifying that they're being watched by this McKay and the Spectre character, and pulls McKay in, and they all try to figure out, what are you doing here? How did you get here? How are you here in the Watchtower? How are you in this, ethereal realm? And McKay basically says to Superman, I'm here, I bring warnings of an Armageddon and oncoming, the revelations and the apocalypse and whatnot. And Superman kind of brushes him aside. He's like, it's not that bad. It's bad, but we're handling it. We've got it covered. And then almost immediately they get word from the Gulag that the inmates are rioting. Inmates, not inmates, but the people in the Gulag are rioting, and so they need to go and handle that. We also see throughout here the UN is on edge, and Luthor basically uses the riot in the Gulag to say now's the time to employ Captain Marvel to go and destroy the Gulag and take things back for humanity. But Batman, it turns out, has been playing a double agent, because if you recall, we ended the last one with him basically saying, yes, Lex, I'm on your side. But here, Batman's like, no, it was all just to figure out what you were doing, because Captain Marvel was like the big wild card, and I didn't know what your plans were for him, but now I do. Now we got to sort that out. So Batson still ends up kind of being a little broken and basically flees, turns into Captain Marvel and flees out of there. And so the League starts to prepare for war, effectively. Wonder Woman and her combat mentality leading the charge. Superman says there's got to be another way, tries to go talk to Batman, and Batman says, you need to worry about Captain Marvel. He's headed that way, and so Superman immediately bolts, and there's a nice little, Batman suddenly turning around and nobody's there. He's like, so that's what that feels like, which we've now seen kind of played out in other iterations of the character over the years, but here in 94, I'm sure, 96, I'm sure, it was one of the first times they really kind of played with that joke and that idea. So we see war wage at the Gulag, and the UN dispatches 3 nukes to the battlefield to wipe out whatever they can, and basically say, superheroes are going to fight, and that war is going to kill us all, so we need to fight back. And do what we can to minimize the damage. Superman and Captain Marvel are locked in battle, so Superman can't really kind of calm the rest of the field like he would want to. Batman and his forces end up joining the fight, but Wonder Woman kills one of the heroes, Von Bach, who we'd heard throughout, was a hero, but he also killed people that had surrendered to him, and so he was very much, that's why he was in the Gulag. And so Wonder Woman stabs him through the chest with the sword, which ends up bringing her into conflict with Batman. They start fighting up into the sky, just in time to see the fighter planes with the nukes coming. They take out 2 of the planes, but the third one drops its nuke. And so Superman sees that it's coming and realizes that his plan of action is he's got to get through to Billy. He doesn't feel it's his place to decide the fate of superhumans or mankind, but Billy can or should, because he exists as both. And so this is where I did not like that decision, because I think that's a really shitty thing to do, to put on effectively a kid or somebody who's kind of been brainwashed for 20 years or whatever, 10 years. It feels like it's trying to wash Clark's hands of having to make the decision, having to make that call, having to say, I'm picking humanity over superhumans or something. It's basically saying, I'm not going to pick. But if his not picking, his inaction is effectively picking humans. And so I just didn't like that beat of the show. That was the thing that rubbed me the most wrong. But ultimately, it works. It gets through to Billy. Billy flies up to meet the nuke, but he doesn't do it in time, or the nuke is still powerful enough that it decimates most of the battlefield. And Superman, surrounded by dead, goes into a rage and flies straight to the UN and starts basically he's going to destroy whatever he can because they've killed so many people. The Spectre, who's been guiding our pastor narrator Norman McKay through all this, basically says, well, that was Judgment Day, we're done here. Thank you for your help, Norman, you can go. And Norman says, no, you brought me through all this just to see death? No. Like, Superman, you saw how pissed he was. If we, don't do anything to stop that, that is evil. He is off to kill these people because he can't stop himself. He's in a rage of filled by death and fueled by that. So he convinces Spectre to take him to the UN, and he basically talks Superman down, says, hey, you have to forgive yourself. This wasn't on you. But you need to recognize that bad things happen. You have to forgive yourself, and he kind of gives a little bit of a sermon to Superman, and that buys enough time for the survivors of the nuclear attack to show up and give Clark hope. And so we start to see Clark return to his humanity. Even the pastor refers to him solely as Clark. Says, Clark, you need to forgive yourself, Clark. Whereas I touched on in the last video, so much of the rest of this story has been him as Kal-El or as Superman, and kind of removing the humanity from his character. So here we see it really start to come back, and Superman or Clark says, okay, the problems we face still exist. We're not going to solve them for you. We're going to solve them with you, not by ruling above you, but by living among you. And so that's a nice little okay, here's the compromise. We will all live together as one. We're not going to watch from the watchtower and keep an eye on things. We're going to work with you guys to figure out, the future moving forward. So you have Batman converts his manor to a hospital for the survivors of the nuke. You have Diana welcomed back among the Amazons, and she becomes a teacher to the remaining metahumans. And then you have Clark in his farm on Kansas, building a memorial to all of the fallen, both the superheroes that passed as well as the million people who died in Magog's incident at the beginning of the story. And he's also setting out to try and farm the land once more, and get the farmland of Kansas back on track. And Norman McKay, our narrator, returns to his pulpit. Lastly, we get a little epilogue here with Clark and Diana meeting Bruce in the cheeky little superhero themed restaurant we saw earlier in the story, and Bruce deduces that, okay, you're here because you're pregnant, I get it, fine, but they surprise him anyway, or Diana surprises him by saying, yes, but we want you to be the godfather, and Clark didn't know that either, but so they're going to have a child, and basically it's going to be the child raised by Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, the child for the future and fighting for a brighter tomorrow. And so it's a very nice little epilogue thing to kind of wrap up on. So those are that's Kingdom Come, second part. Overall, like I said in the last video, this is a lot to take in to somebody who doesn't really know all of the lore and didn't really, I had our time following some of the characters and stuff. Some of the big stuff was pretty easy to track, but a lot of the subtler stuff I felt just was completely flying over my head. Even now I don't know if Magog is an established thing or if that's a character that was created just for this comic, because it's not a hero I've ever heard of before. But I love that it approaches and really tries to tackle Clark as human versus Clark as Superman, as well as, what does it mean to be human in a world surrounded by superheroes. We see, and so much of the story is told from McKay's perspective. We don't get too much of him really chiming in. A lot of his stuff is kind of, biblical quotes and whatnot. But his basic center of being is, how do you be a man of God in a time where gods live among us and superheroes live among us and have basically completely, undone what we read in the Bible. The notion that the Christian God is basically kind of completely emasculated in a world where Superman and all these other superheroes exist. So it's interesting seeing him kind of struggle with that a little bit, but he even says, though, he came to terms with the idea that God was not a singular being a long time ago, and he has been much more philosopher than theologian, perhaps. But it's an interesting perspective to see in, we often talk about the idea that superheroes and comics and stuff are mythology of the modern age, in the same way that the Greeks had their gods and the Romans and whatnot, and Vikings had the Norse mythology. Like, superheroes, Superman, Batman, Marvel, Iron Man, Spider-Man, all that is, the mythos of the modern age. And so I think Kingdom Come is an interesting kind of approach to that mentality, that idea. And the idea of seeing kind of all these characters in significantly older incarnations than we're used to seeing is an interesting one. As I touched on in the last video, I like that there is a little bit more global idea to this. It's really only a few pages, but still it's a few pages more than everything else I've ever seen in terms of kind of the comic space expanding beyond just like the American scene and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to cover. Overall, like, I really enjoyed the story. I'm sure if I had a deeper knowledge of it, I would enjoy it more. And I did, as I said, get a little like irked by Superman's continued inaction throughout this. He's like, he doesn't know what he wants, I think, and that's he's not proactive in this story. He is very reactive throughout, and so I think that's like a weaker aspect of the characters that I don't ever really know, what he would do if not for. I mean, he was in isolation. He was completely content having shut himself away from everybody for 10 years. And it took a monumental disaster of 1 million people dying to bring him back into the fold. And then even when he came back into the fold, he was still trying to kind of live in the past. And so it's a weird dichotomy of like, yeah, I want him to be a stronger character and a more, a character with more depth and more motivation. But here I felt like he was very much just kind of going through the motions of what it is to be Superman. So those are my thoughts on Kingdom Come. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Trevor Starkey from TrevorTrove.com. You can follow me at SnarkyStarkey on Twitter. As I said, if you missed part 1, you can always check that out at the link in the comments below. And until next time, from here at the Trove, treasure your friends.